Hello, welcome to EverydayHDR.com. My name is Blake Rudis, and today I want to talk about my 32-bit workflow that has been modified due to some recent innovations with Adobe Photoshop CC. I'm going to try to do this relatively quick, but it might take me a bit of time, so I'm going to jump right into it. The first thing I'm going to do is open up the folder that my raw files are contained in. So once I get that folder open, I'm going to just go ahead and click all of these and drag them and drop them right into Photoshop. So that will open all of them in Camera Raw. Now in Camera Raw, there's only a couple things I want to do before I go into HDR processing, and that mainly is noise correction and chromatic aberration correction, and we'll do some perspective editing as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is attack the noise. So zoomed in pretty close here at about 332, the noise doesn't seem that bad. This is an ISO 100 photo. So I'm going to go to the detail tab and move the luminance up a bit. About 20 should work for this photograph. Now it's different for every photograph, but 20 should work here. Change the luminance detail to about 40. Now I'm going to go into the lens correction section, and I'm going to go to color. And in color, I want to remove the chromatic aberration. So chromatic aberrations are those green and purple haze you see here on the edges. It happens within the lens. It's common. So I'm going to move the purple up just a little bit and see what that gets me. Sometimes you need to adjust the hue down below as well, and just kind of play with it until you get it to a point that it's acceptable for you. So here's the preview, and here's the afterwards. That looks pretty good to me. Now what I also want to do is zoom out here and go to manual in the lens correction tab. Now what you're seeing here is a photo that was taken with a wide angle lens at its widest focal length, so about 14 millimeters. What that did was it created a perspective issue with the building. It makes it look like it's leaning to the left. So what you can do right here in Camera Raw, I believe you can do it in the new Lightroom as well, is apply a balanced perspective correction to this photograph. So when I press that, it straightens up the photo for me to its best ability. And I think this actually looks pretty good, so I'm going to keep it the way it is. So now what I want to do, because I just did some basic stuff, all I did was fix the perspective of the photo, I fixed the chromatic aberrations and the detail. So now I want to select all three of these, and then I want to press synchronize. And I want to synchronize everything that I just did there. So I'm going to press OK. And that's going to take what I did on the 0 exposure value and do it on all the rest of the photographs. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in and get rid of that spot that's up there, and use my spot removal tool. Get a little bit bigger and see where the selection's coming from. That looks good. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the next one and see if I have another spot here, and I sure do. So I'm going to zoom into that spot, and I'll get a smaller spot removal. I'm pressing the left and right bracket keys in order to increase and decrease the size of my brush. Press OK. Sorry, no, don't press OK. Go to the next one, and if there are any spots, you can fix it there too, but there aren't any here. So now I'm going to select all of these again, press select all, and go to open images. This is going to open all of my photographs right into Photoshop. So once I open them in Photoshop, then I'm going to merge them to HDR. So basically what you're doing on the front side is cleaning up all of the noise in the photograph, any spots in the photograph, and then you're addressing perspective. If you had any lens vignetting, you could go ahead and attack it there too. But don't do too much with exposure. Leave that for the HDR process. So now that all three photographs are open, you can do this with 5, you can do it with 7. For this photograph, I only needed 3. I'm going to go to File, Automate, and then Merge to HDR Pro. Now, if you press Add Open Files, it'll take anything that's in the open pane of Photoshop and put it into the Merge to HDR Pro. Press OK. You also want to make sure that on the bottom there you click the try to align source images. It does a pretty good job of aligning the source images. So I'll just leave it that way, and then select right here. You might open up in 16-bit and you have all the pane here to adjust your HDR image. Go ahead and change that to 32-bit because we're doing 32-bit workflow, and press tone and ACR. Now, that's one of the big differences that you're going to see in Photoshop CC is the tone and ACR. It used to be just press OK and it would open in Photoshop. Now, it's cutting out the middleman. It's cutting out going to Photoshop, saving it as a file, open it in Camera Raw, and it's just letting you go right into Camera Raw, which is much easier for your workflow because you'd be going there anyway. It cuts out one of those steps for you. So while this merges, have some awkward silence. Oh, there we go. All right, so now in Camera Raw, we can get into the nitty-gritty stuff. We can get into the contrast, we can get into the highlights, the shadows, and so on and so forth, and see what we want to do to this photograph. So the first thing I want to do is look at the exposure. And I'm going to press and hold Alt while I do that to make sure I'm not blowing anything out. If I move it to the right, I'm seeing a lot of highlight blowouts. If I release Alt or Option for you Mac people, you'll see a lot of highlight blowouts in their respective color. That's a highlight blowout in the reds, cyans, and blues predominantly. So I'm going to do that until I don't really have any highlight blowouts. But at the same time, still maintain a good photograph. So actually, I think the exposure was just about right. That's part of the process, though. You just go through. Look at the contrast. See, boosting contrast, I don't really like too much. Too little contrast, I don't like too much. It flattens out the image. So I'm going to go with just a little bit less contrast, let's say -10 or so. Move my slider back and forth with my highlights and see what happens there. I'm going to go ahead and decrease the highlights. I like to bring out what's happening in the background. And I'm going to address that a little bit further in a second here as well. Shadows, you can bring those out just a little bit. It kind of gives it more of that HDR feel. So you can already see we're getting a better photograph than the preview essentially here. But what I like about the preview, what we had before, is there's a differentiation between the foreground and the background. It actually makes a three-dimensional looking photograph. Whereas now we've reduced a lot of that contrast and taken away that three-dimensional feel. So I'm going to increase the highlights a little bit to push them back further. And that's one of the things you want to keep in mind as you're doing the HDR process, is that you do not want to create a flat image by reducing your contrast so much that the contrast doesn't exist anymore. So again, I'm going to press and hold the Alt key as I move back and forth with my whites and my blacks to get a good area of what is considered white and a good area as to what is considered black without clipping my shadows or blowing out my highlights. So we're starting to brighten this up a little bit, starting to get some more of that HDR feel in there. Now we can add some clarity if we'd like. And clarity does go a long way with HDR photographs. It gives it that detailed looking feel. But I'm going to address that later in a second. So we won't do any global clarity right now. Now what I'm going to do is hit the adjustment brush. And with the adjustment brush, I'm going to go press Show Mask at the bottom here and go to Auto Mask. And I'm going to select the background. And a lot of times with this show mask, it might be difficult to see your mask if there's a lot of that predominant color in your mask color choice with what's going on in the photo. So you see here, there's red in this brick, and there's also red as my brush, and that really makes it difficult to see what I'm selecting in the church. Now, there's a fix for that though. Right down here where it says show mask, next to that mask overlay color, change that to a contrasting color, something like yellow, to see where your mask is affecting. I'll just go ahead and leave it at that. Unclick show mask, and now I can modify some settings here. I'm just going to zero a lot of these out and start from scratch here. So this was a sunset, and you can't really tell, so I'm going to add some warmth to it to make it appear more like a sunset. And there was a lot of color going on in that sky with the magentas, so I'm going to increase the magentas a little bit too. And let's go ahead and reduce that. I don't like it blue, I like it more on warm side. So I'm going to adjust the exposure as well of just that sky. Darken it up just a little bit, and then maybe hit the highlights, see what happens there. Hit the shadows, see what happens there. No, not really a fan of what's going on. And then maybe increase the saturation a little bit to bring some of the color of that background back in. Now, I don't want to go overboard with saturation. I never want to go overboard with saturation. And I may even bring in some clarity as well to really bring those clouds forward a little bit. So here's the before and after. So we might have gone a little too warm on it. All right, that's much better. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make another adjustment brush setting for the front of the building. So for my foreground, I'm going to select, I want to see my mask, so show mask. And I'm just going to start clicking and dragging to get my mask. Alright, it's a decent mask. We'll go with that. So it defaults to the settings from before. So if I don't like the settings from before, I can go ahead and tweak them accordingly. Now, there's some things I don't like here. I don't like adding the magenta to that red brick. It starts to make it flare up a little bit with a color that bricks don't really tend to be. So I'm going to pull that down just a little bit from where it was before. Let's see what happens when I increase the exposure. Don't like it. Nope, don't do it. That looks about right. Let me look at contrast. This is all part of this fun process we do here as HD artists. We get really particular about our adjustments here. Let's look at that clarity. Now, the clarity within the adjustment brush is not nearly as strong as the clarity that is globally in the actual Adobe Camera Raw basic interface. So keep that in mind as you're using it. You're not going to get quite as much clarity as you may get with the global setting. You can do two adjustment. You can duplicate this same setting here and do another clarity if you want to boost that clarity a little bit more. So I'm gonna leave it, I think, like this. This works for me. I'm gonna go back to our basic pane and see what we've got here. So there was our start. Here's where we're working now. That's not really adjusting with our adjustment brush as well either there. So let's do a boost in clarity here, just to get a little bit more clarity on top of what we already have. A little bit more punch in our details. Alright, so I think I'm pretty good here with what we've got going on. Let me look at a graduated filter. Let me see what we can do with the graduated filter. And we'll go on the increase here with the graduated filter. Increase in warmth. And let's see the preview before and after. The preview's not too bad with that graduated filter. So we can go ahead and select that. I think the background here, though, could use a little bit more of something. Let me see if I can boost it a little bit. I think maybe some more saturation. Too much. Don't like that much saturation. Alright, that looks good to me. So just with the adjustment brush alone, this is what we've done to the photo. Even with the adjustment brush, it looks better. Alright, so now I can go ahead and open this up, press OK, and open this up in Photoshop. It's going to run the Camera Raw filter over it, and then it's going to allow me to edit it right in Photoshop. Which in Photoshop, there's going to be some essential things that we need to do. I still like to do my curves adjustment in Photoshop. I feel like I have a lot more control over my curves adjustments in Photoshop because I can adjust the opacity. I can change it to luminosity. That's stuff you can't do in Adobe Camera Raw. So I'm going to go ahead and add a... I can't add a curves feature just yet because this is still a 32-bit image. So once we get done with our 32-bit image, we're going to go ahead and select 16 bits per channel. So it's going to ask you, if you do this, some of the smart filters might work and they might not be converted correctly. Do you want to do it anyway? Select yes. Do you want to merge it? Let's go ahead and say merge. Let's do that. Now it's going to bring you into the HDR toning panel, and I really do not like the HDR toning in Photoshop. I don't think it really has a place in my HDR workflow. So I'm going to change that to exposure and gamma. And what that does is it keeps me away from HDR toning. I've already done my HDR toning essentially in Adobe Camera Raw. A lot of that toning that I did was very selective in those highlights and shadows adjustments that I did. And keep in mind, those settings that I used are not going to work for every photograph. I don't want you to think that, oh, Blake's magical setting in Camera Raw, I have to have every photograph at 32 highlights and -5 shadows. It doesn't work that way. Every photograph is different. You just have to experiment and play and look at what your artistic eye is going to like. So if we went with that local adaptation and tried to make this look somewhat decent, press OK, we're going to be losing a lot of the value. So just go ahead and go to exposure and gamma, and you don't have to do anything to this. Just press OK. All you're telling Photoshop is, hey, just get me to 16-bit. Because Photoshop, when you go from 32-bit to 16-bit, is assuming that you want to do some HDR toning to it. We don't want to do any HDR toning because we already did the toning. we extracted and we exploited the tone that was already in our photograph in Adobe Camera Raw. So now what I'm going to do is make a curves adjustment. And with that curves adjustment, I'm going to first start with the typical S-curve and see what that does for me. And I like what the S-curve does already. It darkens up my shadows just like an S-curve should. It lightens up my highlights, and it makes both kind of push and pull away from each other. Really kind of makes it pop a little bit. So I'm going to see what else we can do here. One of the things I've been doing a lot recently is going to select, color range, and going to select just the shadows. And do a curves adjustment for just the shadows. And then maybe change that to just soft light, see what happens. Okay, it's a little too much, so we'll drop the opacity on that. And what that does, it just helps bring out my shadows just a little bit. And then you can go right here to the filter. And if we look at our, not filter, sorry, but go to the properties. If we look at our mask, it's very hard edged. It's got a lot of hard edges on that. And those don't tend to blend well with our photograph. So if you change the feather just a little bit, just to like maybe 3 or 4, and then I saw my mask by just holding Option on my mask. So if you hold Option on the mask, it'll just give you what the mask looks like. So here's a before and after. If it's too much, you can always adjust the opacity a little bit and bring it down a little bit. So I'm going to do the same thing for my highlights and see what happens there. I'm going to select color range and go to highlights. And I do this to separate my lights and my darks from one another. I'm going to do another curves adjustment. And I'm going to see what happens when I set that to soft light. Again, brings my lights out a little bit, but maybe a little bit too much. So I'm going to go ahead and go into that properties of the mask, feather it just a little bit, maybe a little bit more for this one, and then bring the opacity down. So that's what we got right out of Camera Raw, and this is where we're at now. Just boosted things up a little bit. And now what I can also do is duplicate the background layer, bring it up to the top, and do a high pass sharpen on it. So I'm going to go into filter, go to other, and go to high pass. And I'm going to change that to something really small like 0.4. Actually, let's go with 0.8. 0.8. Press OK. And you can't really see what it's doing right now, but if we press linear light, you'll see that it's really sharpening up this photograph. And it's sharpening it up way too much at 0.8. So I'm going to change that opacity down real low. I like to start a little higher and work my way down with the opacity. Then start low and have to duplicate it. So it all depends on what your personal preference is when it comes to sharpening. So that does sharpen up this photograph just a little bit without destroying it and making it look really halo edged. And that's the basic workflow. I could go on for hours with this photograph and keep pushing it and keep pulling from it because it is a 32-bit. Well, now it's a 16-bit, but there's a lot of color depth there. There's a lot of information in this photograph. I mean, just alone, we've extracted from 3 exposures a lot of exposure value into the +6, -6 range. So there's a lot we can do with this because there's a lot of information that's been stored in this file. And I really could go on for a long time, but that would bring this video about another 20 minutes. So I'm going to leave it here. Again, you could continue to post-process this further. You could throw cross-processing on here. You could throw anything you want at it, what your normal HDR workflow is, or what your normal workflow is for that matter. So again, this is my 32-bit HDR workflow with Adobe Photoshop CC. My name is Blake Rudis with the website www.everydayhdr.com. I highly implore you go there and take a look at the website because I do a lot more on the website than I do here on my my Everyday HDR channel in YouTube. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.